So welcome everybody to another Behind the Theme. Today we'll be talking about Hammer the Scots again, and today we'll be completing the saga of William Wallace with the Battle of Falkirk and his fall, and the next time we'll be talking about Robert the Bruce. So let's get into it. Now the first thing to take note is William Wallace has become the Guardian of Scotland. He has started taking back Scottish lands from English garrisons and everything, and then he feels he needs to do more, and he leads a raid into northern England. Now I call this a raid because just like Robert the Bruce after Bannockburn, attacking northern England made sense. It gets you plunder, it gets you money, and on top of that, it hits and weakens the English, if at nothing more than their prestige. Although I disagree with most of what some people say that Wallace wanted to lead an army into London and all. And that is because if the opportunity arrived for him to go to London, he would have took it. But I think seriously a man of his practicality more than likely must have said that, you know what, this is a limited raid, and he knew it, in my view. And it's also at this point that you can tell that there's more of a William Wallace the man that comes out, because from English accounts, they say that he burned monasteries, people were killed, innocent, so on and so forth. Even the Scottish Chronicles admitted that there were misdoings, but they do tend to give Wallace a pass by saying that Wallace came in to curb the excesses of his men. Now, while all this is happening, of course, Edward I, Longshanks himself, did not just sit idle. He was preparing, and he did. From different sources, some say that Edward I's army that leads into Northern England at this point is the biggest army till the 18th century on the English continent. There's another source that says that Edward II's army that leads to Bannockburn is the largest. And to what I see, I can't really conclusively say one or the other. So, in my view, I think probably more than likely it's Edward II's army. But again, look at the sources and decide for yourself. Now, this huge English army now goes north and is unstoppable. It just keeps going and going and going. And Wallace, amazingly, of course, did the right thing from his background. He's burned the supplies, he kept running, and the English army started to weaken. Edward I, he knew that he could not stay long, that this army was taking a lot of money every single day. But at some point, and this is, again, different sources say different things, so I'm going to give you both sides of it. One says Edward I's army gets near enough and force marches and reaches Wallace, whereas the other says that Wallace kept running and could have continued running, which I personally believe so, but for some reason decided to make a stand. Maybe he felt he couldn't get far enough, or maybe he felt he'll be running forever, who knows, but Wallace makes a stand, and he makes a stand at Falkirk. Now, it was lucky though, because the English were running out of food, and if they did not catch Wallace soon enough, they either had to winter in Scotland, which would have been much, much more expensive, or in fact, retreat back to England. And going to the game, this actually feels a lot like in history, because when you play the game, as you go further north, you only have a limited amount of time, which represents the coming of winter. And most of the time, if you always start at the English border and you go north, you basically will get to about halfway through Scotland, or maybe a bit more, and then winter will hit. And then you have two choices. One, either you winter in Scotland, or you move all your troops basically back into northern England, and next year you can come forth again. In fact, the rulebook actually tells you that if you actually want to reach northern Scotland, that you have to winter in Scotland. So it just shows the logistical problems that the English had fighting in Scotland. And it's at this point that the Skiltron makes its debut. Now, the Skiltron is a round formation of men huddled together very tightly and holding 12-foot long pikes and holding them outward. So basically, you have like a hedgehog with spikes pointing everywhere. And this was done obviously for two reasons. One is because the Scots did not have good heavy cavalry. In fact, many of the good heavy cavalry in Scotland, the knights, were fighting on the English side. On top of that, a lot of the Scottish army was infantry, and Scotland was not the richest country in the world, meaning that the Skiltron had another upside. It was that the pikes were cheap and easy to make. And from all accounts, William Wallace was the one who created this formation. Obviously, I personally feel taking the inspiration from the phalanx of the Macedonians and so on. And also it shows how much William Wallace was a good commander. He knew the strengths and weaknesses of his army, and he came up with ideas and solutions to deal with those situations. Now for the Battle of Falkirk, to summarize, It basically was a bunch of schiltrons formed together, and the Scots had cavalry and some archers. The English had their army, and of course the famous Welsh bowmen, which could shoot the longbow. And long story short, the Scottish nobles' cavalry ran away. And when they ran away, there was no longer a threat for the Welsh bowmen, which again outranged the Scottish bowmen, which again were outnumbered by the Welsh bowmen. And with the schiltron being a tightly formed formation and pretty much immobile for the most part, unless the men were trained to move in, and even if they moved, it was a very slow process. The Welsh bowmen just fired into the schiltrons and decimated them. Wallace was amazingly lucky to get away, and that was the Battle of Falkirk. Now, unlike what most people think, even though Edward I won at Falkirk and basically Scotland was back in English hands, William Wallace continued to fight the good fight for 7 years. He in fact at one point even landed all the way in France, asking the King of France for help, and then asking the Pope at one point for help. And this is the point where I feel William Wallace was a true patriot, because he actually got out of Scotland. He could have stayed there overseas and not come back, but he did come back. And for me, one cannot deny that when he gets out of the bad situation and you go back in, that's a true show that he's dedicated to the cause. Again, arguable, I feel personally, whether he was dedicated to the cause when he first started out, because there were arguments whether he was actually an outlaw who just picked up the idea. But at this point, after Falkirk, or even after Stirling, that he becomes a true patriot, even if he wasn't at first. Now, at some point, William Wallace does come back to Scotland. He has been declared an outlaw, and everybody's looking for him to gain favor with Edward I. And sadly to say, it is true he was betrayed. The person who gave him up was Sir John Menef, who they said was actually the godfather of Wallace's 2 children. And of course, then Wallace is taken to England, where because he was an outlaw, he was basically declared guilty from the start. There was no defense allowed. There was no need for a jury or whatever. And they laid charges on him left and right, and one of those was of course treason. To which Wallace, in the gist of it, how could he have performed treason when he never declared that Edward I was his king? Pretty much the case that he was hung, drawn, quartered, and gutted. And of course his head was boiled, hung on London Bridge, the rest of the parts of his body scattered to the far realms to warn against treason against the great English king. And just to note, there is actually in the Hammer of the Scots board game that the whole campaign is you play William Wallace and then Robert the Bruce in one full long campaign. But you can play actually the William Wallace campaign only. It actually does feel like a full game, and actually I played that twice and it's actually very fun. So in conclusion, I think the important thing about William Wallace is, on a practical side, one, he showed that the English could be defeated, and two, is that the legacy is that no matter what, people could use him, or rather martyr him, as a symbol for what is resistance to the English. And that is why, even though I am sad that we do not have the historical evidence for the real man, it is still worthy of note that his place in history is done really well, and that I truly believe done by a patriot, of which will spark the complete difference of how I feel, although still give great credit to our next historical figure, Robert the Bruce. So, subscribe, comment, let me know what you think. Thank you very much. Till next word.